This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
And I think that's an even bigger headache for brewers who, it's one thing to have the beer chemistry change, it's another thing to have the beer just slow down in the brewery and spend another week in the cellar.
This week on the show, Tom Shellhammer joins us for a live recording during the Craft Brewers Conference in Denver. We talk about the latest findings regarding varietal differences in hop creep, and Jeff Clawson joins us to talk about the new brewery at OSU.
Tom, you joined us for episode 98, Dry Hop Creep. This time we're here to catch up on what you've learned since. Specifically, you've been studying hop creep across different varieties.
Yeah, exactly. So when this first arose, we talked about it in that last podcast, this collaboration we had, or joint investigation, I should say, we had with Allagash, and realizing that there is quite a substantial amount of residual enzyme activity in hops, and we were looking at Cascade hops and their ability to reduce and break down non-fermentable dextrins into something fermentable. There was a bunch of obvious questions came up, particularly talking with different brewers, which is, why does this not always happen with every beer? Why does it happen differently with different wort systems? Could there possibly be a varietal effect? That was one of the first things that came up in talking with breweries who was saying, hey, I find this in one type of IPA, but not another type of IPA. I mean, still to this day, when I talk to brewers, not every brewer experiences this phenomenon. And those that do experience it in varying different degrees. Some have like big headaches with it, that their beers dry out. They're like making brewed IPAs without even trying. And then others kind of look at me and say, we don't see this at all. So anyway, that's sort of the launching off point, which is, does variety matter? And we made a pitch to the BA for some funds, and they funded this project a year and a half ago, and where we looked at 30 different hop varieties to see, is there a varietal difference in the residual enzymatic activity? And sort of the progression of the study is that we worked with the Allagash guys, basically dry hopping Coors Banquet beer and seeing that there was an effect. And we could see this using just the alkalizer. We could follow alcohols and we could follow RE. We looked for a different approach for measuring enzyme activity. We used some enzyme kits. Those worked pretty well, but they got a little bit expensive and they were very specific, almost too specific. So,
and you had to adapt those from some malt enzyme kits.
Yeah, we're using basically off-the-shelf malt enzyme kits. But malt enzyme is loaded with enzyme, and hops are not. So we had to do some modifications so that we could, have enough sensitivity to see the impact on the hops.
Can you remind us which enzymes are relevant here?
Yeah, good point. So there's 2 sets of enzymes, if you think about them in terms of general classes. One set of enzyme are the enzymes that you'd find in malt. These are enzymes that would break down linear portions of starch, so alpha and beta amylase. And the part that is probably the most important in this story is the other set of enzymes, those that can deal with branched dextrins. And malt has a little bit of this, but a very low amount, and during the mashing process, the temperature is high enough that these get inactivated, and the mashing time is short enough that you don't really see an effective debranching activity of the malt-based enzymes, and that results in wort that has a bunch of residual extract, a bunch of residual non-fermentables. It turns out that hops have a set of enzymes that can break these branch dextrins, and it's a very small amount, and it's a very low activity, but given that brewers use lots of hops when they dry hop, and there's a fairly long residence time, you can actually see the effect of this. And I should also point out that we're not really certain that these enzymes are coming from the hops themselves. People have asked me, could these be from microbiota that are on the hops themselves? And yeah, it's entirely possible, and that's another thing to look at is, are there either fungi or bacteria present on hops that you would find in the field that could have the same effect? And we're not sure.
After that Allagash experiment that we talked about and that you just mentioned, I believe you looked at for the enzyme activity in hop extract. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the approach was to do an aqueous extract of hops and look at the enzyme activity in those as opposed to in beer. And that worked okay, and we actually worked with like a soluble starch substrate, but we found that the results were not quite the same as with beer, and so we turned our attention to an assay in which we use beer, and we dry hop the beer. We add an antimicrobial to prevent any sort of microbial growth, so that we're not actually following re-fermentation, we're just following a change in the carbohydrate profile of the wort using liquid chromatography. So in short, the wort doesn't have any simple sugars, it's got dextrins, or not the wort, but the beer does. And after this dry hopping process on the bench, we can see the conversion of dextrins into simple sugars, and we just calculate the rate and amount of those.
So that's, you're talking about, that was sort of the third angle that you took after you looked at the extracts, right?
Yeah, it's to track sugars. The first approach, like with the Allagash guys, is you've got yeast and hops and beer, and so any sort of fermentable sugars that were being produced by the action of the enzymes in the hops would be converted by the yeast into alcohol. And so what you would see is a reduction in residual extract and an increase in alcohol.
Okay, and what you're saying is you did definitely see those fermentable sugars increase after you did that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So this sort of second or third approach is to eliminate the yeast part of that, so we don't add any yeast in these bench scale dry hop processes, and in fact we add an antimicrobial to make sure that we don't infect the system and see yeast consuming the sugars, because we don't want the sugars to disappear. We actually want to be able to measure them, and we can measure them using liquid chromatography.
Okay, and then next you wanted to take a closer look at dextrins to verify that they were indeed the source of the fermentable sugars produced. Tell us how you went about that and what you found.
Yeah, so this approach that we use using liquid chromatography allows us to look at more than just the simple sugars. We can look at the smaller dextrins. So, and we're going to call it like either by the length of polymerization, like G1 would be glucose, G2 would be maltose, G3 maltotriose, G4 maltotetrose, etc. And so this liquid chromatography technique using a oligosaccharide column allows us to differentiate dextrins up to about G10. And we don't know the branching degree on them, but we can at least characterize them as in gross, like hunks. So here's a hunk of DP4, could be linear or branched, DP5 or G5, linear or branched. And we can see those as separate peaks on a chromatogram. And what we essentially do over the course of a time scale of following dry hopping is see the degradation of these dextrins, G4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and the increase in the simple fermentable sugars, G1, 2, and 3.
All right, that's pretty cool. So after that, you then set up an experiment to profile carbohydrates in dry hopped beer. Talk about that. In the development of this assay, one of the questions we had was, if we're going to use beer instead of like a maltodextrin substrate, what beer would we use? And we, rather than doing an exhaustive profile, we looked at a number of different beers that might be useful. Like one of them was this Coors Banquet beer that we had used with the original Allagash experiment. And as you might not be surprised to know, is like there's a pretty broad range in the dextrin profile of different beers. And like a classic example of this would be a brut IPA to which a brewer has added a whole bunch of enzymes to
really drive down the dextrin content versus a really low fermentable, high extract, double IPA. And what we found in looking at a range of different beers is that some beers still had fermentable sugars, and those beers were excluded as a potential candidate because we're actually trying to track the production of simple sugars, and we don't want to have the interference of a background level of simple sugars. And then we also found that beers had different degrees of residual extract or dextrins. So of this very cursory examination of a handful of beers, we just went after the beer that had no simple sugars and the highest amount of dextrins left behind. And so it was this big IPA.
And you found that the most dramatic changes occurred pretty quickly, I think, in that first day.
Yeah, that's really it's kind of a surprising thing that we found. And we saw this also with that experiment with the Coors Banquet beer with Allagash, is that within the first 2 days of dry hopping, there was a dramatic reduction in residual extract and a big bump in alcohol. And then after that, there was a continued reduction, but it was like at a different rate. It was almost like a different set of enzymes or a different substrate. And that was actually fortuitous because we didn't want to run these assays over 2 weeks. So we found that we could get a pretty big signal in the first day. And to make life easy, we just focused on the simple sugars and we focused on the change that occurred in the first day.
Great. Now, getting to the main question we asked at the beginning, how much does hop creep vary by cultivar? You studied 30 different varieties. There's a lot of different hops out there these days. How did you decide which ones to include in this study?
So there was a number of different factors. One was what are hops that brewers use for dry hopping? You definitely want to have those in the mix. But as a counterpoint, what are hops that brewers don't use for dry hopping? Because we want to see,
why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
Exactly. North American hops versus European hops versus Southern Hemisphere hops. The European hops are there as almost like a control, right? Because people don't dry hop with Pearly, but everybody's dry hopping with Amarillo. So a little bit of it was trying to create a decent spread of the map of potential cultivars without really knowing what we're going to look at, but not trying to be exhaustive and look at 200 different hop varieties.
Yeah. Okay, well, give us a lowdown on the overall experimental design for this one.
Right, so this dry hop method this enzyme characterization method relied on benchtop dry hopping is what we used. We used the beer that had the high dextrins. This happened to be Ninkasi's Total Dom. And that was convenient because they were just down the street. They'd send us up kegs of this beer, and away we go. So we do these small-scale dry hoppings in replicate on the bench and monitor them for a few days and take samples and run them on the LC and track the production of simple sugars. And so the index we used was the production of glucose, maltose, and maltotriose as a measure of how much enzyme performance. So if we see more production of these simple sugars, that's a direct measurement of the enzyme power of the hops. Hence, those hops are more enzymatically active, which from a brewer takeaway would mean that they would result in a greater reduction in greater reduction in dextrins, and also the potential. Imagine if this is happening post-packaging, the greater production of sugars, and hence the greater potential for re-fermentation.
Coming up.
Disease pressure could have an impact on how these plants express these enzymes. Definitely post-harvest processing we know has an effect.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Whitcomb Selinsky McAuliffe PC serves all brewers in registering and protecting trademarks, navigating the label approval process, and assisting with OSHA inspections and safety compliance. Please go to wsmlawpc.com for more information.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District Pittsburgh meets April 15th. The Brewery Packaging and Technology course starts in Madison April 21st. District St. Louis meets April 25th at Second Shift Brewery. The 58th Annual District Caribbean Convention joins forces with District Southeast in Miami May 2nd through the 5th. This is going to be a big meeting with lots of great speakers, including folks who've been on this podcast. Joe Hertrick, Andrew Fradiani, John Mallett, Roy Johnson, Dr. John Paul May, Andy Tavikram, and more. District Philly also meets May 3rd at 2SP Brewing. If you're barrel aging, don't miss the May 9th webinar screening for Lactobacillus acetotolerans in a brewery setting. District St. Paul, Minneapolis meets May 16th at the Star Keller in New Ulm. District St. Louis is at Old Bakery Brewery May 16th. And District Northern Illinois meets at Half Acre Beer May 31st. It's time to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. Check out the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show.
Okay, now these 30 different varieties ended up in 4 classes. Talk about how you got there.
Yeah, so we can use some statistical techniques to look at the amount of covariation in the production of these simple sugars. You can imagine that what we found is like there was one class of hops. When I talk about a class, we're talking about like a statistical grouping, right? There's no pedigree class, there's no geographical class, it's just enzyme performance class. And the fact that it's not a simple like one dextrin goes to glucose, it's like dextrins can be broken down into smaller dextrins, and those dextrins can be broken down into sugars in different manners depending upon the type of enzymes that are there. It results in a display of the different simple sugar productions being non-uniform. So one class of hops tended to produce more fructose and glucose. Another class of hops tended to produce more maltose. And another class of hops, they just did really neither. There was an increase, but not as dramatic. And so we got 4 statistical classes that we could characterize as being high enzymatic activity. That means they produce a lot of fermentable maltose. Low, meaning that they produce sugars, but they produce the lowest amount of sugars of the class. And then this kind of group in between that were just sort of medium. And that sort of validates or whatever proves the hypothesis that variety matters. And unfortunately it's not as clean as that, but we could say that of the 30 varieties, we could group these into different classes based upon enzyme performance. What we're left though is that really like a varietal difference?
Yeah,
or is it something else?
You saw some pretty big differences within the same cultivar over different crop years, right?
Yeah, so just kind of not by design, a little bit by fluke, we included 2 different samples of an Amarillo variety, one from one crop year and one from another crop year. And these 2 of the same varieties ended up in 2 different classes of hops, one in the high enzyme and one in the low, which is kind of like, it kind of makes you scratch your head. But then when you kind of circle back to it, it's kind of like, well, okay, this is, I think it still points to the fact that there are varietal differences, but it also points to the fact that there are probably other things going on.
Yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, I think in the last episode, it's hard to tease out varietal differences versus agronomic versus what happens on the kiln, on the farm, or even processing. So
hop maturity could have an impact.
Yeah.
Disease pressure could have an impact on how these plants express these enzymes. Definitely post-harvest processing we know has an effect. We've done, on a separate study, we've been doing some hop kilning research, looking at how kilning temperature influences hop quality.
And that's the stuff with the hop quality group, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Actually, Hop Research Council.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and that may be something food for another podcast.
Sure.
But anyway, in that study where we're actually playing with temperature, we see that temperature impacts enzyme activity.
Which makes sense.
Makes sense,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
The higher kiln temperature hops have lower enzyme activity. So what we're seeing in those 2 Amarillo samples could be farm effect, kilning effect,
Bed depth.
effect,
Yeah.
storage effect. Who knows? So it's not as clean as here's a set of hops that I can guarantee are low enzyme producers versus these that are always going to give you a high enzyme producer. We need to actually come around and do that a few more times with like the same variety on different farms and different.
So what's the plan for that? I mean, because now that you've sort of made a dent in this, saying that there's clearly a varietal component to it, but you want to learn more about these other influencing factors. Like, where do you go from there?
Well, yeah, this is kind of the cool thing about science is that you answer one question and you open up a whole bunch of new questions. Yeah. Which is really cool from a scientific perspective.
And from a job security perspective.
And for job security. But brewers don't want me to ask more questions. They're like, solve the problem, right? Like, how can we stop the hop creep?
Right.
I can tell you really quickly, you can solve it with pasteurization, but that runs into like a philosophical dilemma for brewers that don't want to pasteurize. But, and there may be other ways to try to solve this problem. But there's obvious questions like as we're wading into the kilning effect, can we manipulate this on the kiln? To what degree does harvest maturity have an effect? And really, does hop cultivar impact this like consistently, regardless of where you find those cultivars? So those are the questions I want to ask. I just need some money to help, study these, right? Because I got to hire students, and we got consumables, and we got to go on the farm and get samples, and the farmers are very gracious in providing time on their kilns and providing samples, but I still need money to get the work done. So
fair enough.
If you have ideas there, it would be great.
All right. Well, hopefully there's some folks listening to this that have a financial interest in answering some of these questions.
You bet. We've got 2 publications out on this, one in the journal Ag Food Chem, one in the journal of the ASBC. You search for Kaylin Kirkpatrick and Shellhammer. Kaylin Kirkpatrick is a graduate student who worked on this project. She's graduated from OSU. She now works at Cornell University. She's a brewing extension associate doing teaching and research on this topic. She actually has a webinar on this coming up in a week or 2. So there's publications out there on this.
That's through ASBC, right? The webinar?
Yep, exactly. I guess, another thing maybe we could talk about just briefly is that this issue of hop creep is vexing and troublesome for brewers who are trying to get beer through the brewery on a regular schedule and with a consistent quality, right? So the same degree of fermentability. But what I hear from many brewers is that is an even greater headache is a diacetyl spike that comes from this dry hop creep, and that's another area that we're digging into. Is why does that occur? Is it simply because of the re-fermentation, or is there something else going on? And I think that's an even bigger headache for brewers who, it's one thing to have the beer chemistry change, it's another thing to have the beer just slow down in the brewery and spend another week in the cellar.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yep.
And one great way to build some insurance into your process with that is to add some ALDC to your fermentation.
Exactly.
Too, so.
Yep. A little bit of enzyme help from a different source can mitigate that diacetyl spike.
While I had a chance to chat with Tom at CBC, Jeff Clawson also joined us to talk about some big brewery upgrades at OSU.
Yeah, so we're just finishing up expansion of the research brewery.
Okay.
So we've got a fully automated 2.5 hectoliter 5-vessel system that we put together January 2018. Since then, we've been running 85 brews through.
And how much of an upgrade was that? What were you coming from? What was the previous setup?
Yeah, our previous setup was a 2-barrel brew house. It was really a pub brewery. We had a mash cooker, combination mash lauter tun, and a kettle. and not a lot of sophistication there. We had flow meter and some temperature control, but for the most part, everybody was moving valves and grinding their own grain and tossing it in, using a paddle to mix it together. So now, fully automated system, computer operated. We sit down and put it together.
Yeah, it gives students a new, entirely different learning opportunity, because the students are going to see the kind of automation and the human-computer interface that you would find in a modern brewery. So that thing is like a giant step up in terms of our teaching capabilities. There's also a big step up in terms of safety, the fact that the brewery is going to clean itself in a secure manner. The risk of having like a hot caustic blowout is way reduced. So that's another positive thing. And then just the automation lends a level of repeatability that we wouldn't have seen in the old brewery. So we still keep the old brewery. I like to say it's kind of like the 1996 Toyota Camry that we don't mind giving the keys to anybody. And now we've got a 2017 Audi sitting in the parking lot that after they learn to drive on the Camry, then we turn the keys over.
Fair enough.
Yeah. I think it just elevates our capabilities.
Sure.
And what we're able to do as far as research and teaching and project work with industry.
Yeah, and it's really satisfying. Our program's been around since '96, and we've been working off of equipment that was donated to us back then, at a time when the industry was in a very different spot than it is now. The entire industry is more sophisticated in terms of its understanding of beer and the equipment that's required to produce high-quality beer. So it's very satisfying to see this evolution in our program that matches the technical expertise of what we do from a scientific level.
That was Tom Shellhammer and Jeff Clawson here on the Master Brewers podcast. Do you have a question about hop creep? Post your question to Ask the Brewmasters, the industry's best technical forum, at community.mbaa.com. Did you know that Master Brewers now has a mobile app? TQ articles, podcasts, webinars, Ask the Brewmasters, and more, all in the same place. Search Master Brewers in the App Store to download it now.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast. And then I fall on the ground. Just like that one day, like everyone